From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
I just told Hannah Pittard and Elizabeth Hand that I was a little afraid of them. And if you are readers of their wonderful and slightly disturbing fiction, more than slightly, you know what I'm talking about. They're both such inventive writers who really take readers like us into places that we couldn't even imagine. And what I find after reading both of, especially their most recent novels, is that I can't get images out of my head. And I can't forgive them for some images. So some of you know what I'm talking about. Hannah Pittard is the author of 3 novels, Reunion, and The Fates Will Find Their Way, and her most recent novel, Listen to Me. She's published short stories in American Scholar and McSweeney's, and teaches fiction at the University of Kentucky. Listen to Me, in particular, has garnered the kind of praise that just gladdens an author's heart. It is an editor's choice of the New York Times Book Review. It was also selected by the Washington Post as one of the top suspense novels to read this past summer. Elizabeth Hand is the best-selling author of 13 novels and 4 collections of short fiction, and she spans almost every type of genre that you could possibly think of. Speculative fiction, fantasy fiction, horror fiction, crime novels, noir. She's done it all. She has won, among other awards, the World Fantasy Award 4 times, the Nebula Award twice, the Shirley Jackson Award twice, and the International Horror Guild Award 3 times. I had the pleasure of reviewing Elizabeth's latest Cass Neary novel, Hard Light, for the Post a few months ago. It's her 3rd in her series featuring Cass Neary, who's a hard-living photographer and also described as a woman of a certain age with substance abuse issues. Like her novel, Walking the Moon, which I read some 20 years ago, it is something that I now can't get out of my brain. So I want you to please welcome me in thanking Hannah Pittard and Elizabeth Hand.
Thank you. That was
well, thank you. Where do we start? I want to start with your killer first sentences. Each of you have written first sentences that, you know, when I open up a book and I think, okay, especially if it's a choice, do I go further with this novel or not? It's not just the ingenuity of your first sentences, it's the authority of the voices, it's the sly wit. So, Elizabeth, your latest Cass Neary novel, Hard Light, begins, "A stolen passport will only get you so far." And Hannah, your first sentence is, "They were on the road later than they intended." Sorry, they were on the road later than they intended. I'm yours for the rest of the novel. I wanted to know, first of all, I think it would be helpful, not everyone has read your latest work, if you could give us a sense of what follows from those openings, and also maybe talk about how important the first sentence, the first paragraph is, particularly to a suspense novel, to a crime novel. Are the stakes higher with that kind of novel than with straight literary fiction?
I think that they can be, absolutely. For me, you have to set up a lot in that opening sentence, in the opening chapter, in the opening paragraph, that by the end of the book, everything comes back into light in a different way, that things viewed initially change and morph by the end, but that the clues and the germ is there, or are there at the beginning. And it's essential that Mark and Maggie, who are taking this road trip together, it's absolutely essential that how they begin that road trip is other than how they expect it to begin, because everything that happens afterwards, and causality is a huge part of this novel, and it's something that I'm very interested in as a writer. But the fact that the road trip begins other than it should is responsible for the events that unfold at the end. The tragedy that occurs at the novel's end would not have happened if they'd gotten off at the right time or earlier, if they'd missed a traffic jam, if they'd been able to drive all the way through instead of having to stop at a hotel.
Yeah, I think I agree with Hannah. I think it's sort of a matter of you never get a second chance to make a first impression. And I think with suspense novels or with noir, even more than with other kinds of fiction where, as a reader and a reviewer, I always read the beginning and the end of a book first. I always pick it up. I read the first sentence, I read the ending. And I've done that my whole life. And I think I've had to learn over the years how to write a first sentence. And I think in particular with writing, noir novels, suspense novels, there's more of a weight on it because readers come to those kinds of stories with different kinds of expectations than you bring to another kind of a book. So I think that other kinds of fiction, you obviously want to have a hook from the very beginning. You do want to have a strong opening sentence, but I think that with more quote-unquote literary fiction, people can ease into the story more, whereas with a suspense novel or a crime novel, the expectations as a reader that you bring into it, you want to immediately be there in media res. You want to be there as it starts. You want to be there in the stuck in traffic, trying to get to where you're going.
Or with a passport that
flee the storm.
A stolen passport.
Yeah, or the stolen passport. So I think there's that sense of immediacy that your book has, and that I have tried to get in particular with the Cass Neary novels.
Well, you've already touched on it, but you both resurrected the journey as a motif. I mean, Cass goes on a journey in hard light. You've got Maggie and Mark in this car with their dog. I mean, it's as old as the Odyssey. You mentioned the Iliad. You start off with that epigraph from the Iliad. How do you rejuvenate the journey as a motif for a story?
I think it's. I can't remember who was the first person to teach me this because I've heard it so many times and I teach it so often now, but if you make your characters want something, that makes them relatable, it makes them interesting, and for me, with Listen to Me, there is this very easy, natural thing that they both want, that is the concrete, visceral thing. They want to get to Charlottesville, Virginia. It's very easy. Existentially, they want other things. Mark wants his normal wife back. Maggie wants to lose the feelings of paranoia. She wants to be normal again too. But I love the road trip. I think it's a very American type story. I think Lolita is a road trip novel, and a great one at that, and also a thriller and a mystery. And I begin my novel with that nod to the Iliad, which is this. On the one hand, it's the story of a 10-year war, but it's Homer does this great trick. He tells us only about the last 3 weeks of the war, but in telling us about those last 3 weeks of the war, he fills in the 10 years. And Listen to Me does something sort of similar. In many ways, we're only with Mark and Maggie for 24 hours, but the trick of the book, if it's successful, is to sort of fill in a 10-year marriage in just those 24 hours. You're going to ask questions, and I'm going to constantly not answer them.
No, I think
or switch.
The answer. And I think, too, the other thing with your novel is it's a road trip, which is this very American trope in fiction. But it's also something just about all of us have done at some point in our life. And many of us have had this awful claustrophobic, sense of being trapped in a car with someone whether you're, trying to get home from college over Thanksgiving weekend, or you're with your spouse on vacation and you've left too late to get somewhere, or you're a kid trapped in the car with your parent, or you're a teenager trapped with your parent, which is like the worst thing in the world. And so I think you evoke this kind of, very iconic American experience with that. With the Cass novels in particular, which Hard Light is the third one, she's a character who is, old-fashioned pinball machines where the ball would be in play and it's just bouncing around. You're trying to keep it moving without going down the chute. She's kind of like a ball in play. Her life has been in stasis for many decades, living on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. And in the first novel, she is kind of tempted out of her lair and goes up to an island off the coast of Maine, and hijinks ensue. And then in the second book, she goes to Reykjavik, and in the third one, she's in London, and she's basically on the lam. She's kind of on the run, so she's now in a place on a stolen passport, but she's always very much an outsider. So she's not, and I think that's an experience that Americans can have a lot in this country. Because we're defined, or if we're not defined by, we live in different regions that, living in downtown Manhattan is very different from living in rural Maine, or from living in, the panhandle of Texas, or something like that. So that, and then if you go abroad, your sense of being an outsider can be really magnified. So in that sense, it's kind of a journey of what it's like to be the ugly American in your own country and then somewhere else.
I want to talk about weather, because both of your novels, are just, in a sense, extreme adventure tales about weather as well. You've got a tornado going on in Look at Me, impending, which is also a great device to knock out the GPS and everything else that we rely on.
I'll do anything to get rid of technology. I'll set it in 1980.
Yeah.
I'll do anything.
Yeah. And when Cass arrives in London, there's a monstrous hail and rainstorm going on, that the likes of which hasn't been seen in 300 years or so. I mean, it's fun weather as almost another character, but I did feel in both your novels that the weather was also this way to sort of peel off that skin of normalcy and say, things can get really weird in ordinary life really fast. And if you'd like to talk about weather and how you came up with that device, I'd love to know about it.
Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't thought of that. I think that's one reason why I loved your book so much. I love reading about bad weather.
We both like violent weather.
Yeah, it's funny. Throughout my career, many of my books and a lot of my short fiction has had kind of apocalyptically bad weather in it. And I think it's actually, for me, I think it actually goes back to, my childhood, being raised Catholic, and from a very, very young age, this notion of the end of the world, which I could only imagine as like an earthquake, which, I grew up in Yonkers, there was not a lot of earthquakes. But I think from watching, movies or things, I was really impressed and frightened by apocalyptic weather. And then moving to Maine, where basically all people ever talk about is the weather for 6 months of the year. It's like no one in Maine has ever seen snow because the way they talk about the weather, it's just, and of course now with smartphone technology and, the disaster weather channel and everything else, and with climate change, that gets intensified. But I'm fascinated by it, and I've been writing about and thinking about climate change for almost 20 years, and seeing a lot of the things that I wrote about in earlier speculative fiction books that were sort of near future books in which all of these terrible weather events would happen. I would never in a million years have imagined that actually we're living that now. When I wrote the books or stories, it was science fiction. And now it's like our everyday life. So, I can't keep up with it. So it's very easy for me to transpose that, say, to London or Cornwall. And cities are very fragile places. we found, you found out here and in New York after Sandy, and New Orleans and Vermont after Irene, which is not a city, but the weather is something we cannot control. And in your book, on the small scale, if you're in this little bubble of a car, and a tornado, that's like my worst nightmare.
Yeah, I think there's something about weather that, at least for me, I'm terrified of being out in, terrific rainstorms. I don't like I'm like my grandmother, I don't like driving in the rain at all. But there is, at the same time, there's this, it seems like there's nothing like weather or the promise of bad weather, not when it's actively happening, but just when they're telling you that it's going to happen, to elicit in me just a terrific amount of hubris. I can see that it's going to, 65% chance that it's going to rain, and I will look my umbrella in the face as I am leaving, and I'll say, nope. I'm not going to take the umbrella because I'm pretty sure I'm going to time it, and then I'll stand in my office and just watch the water and think, there was the umbrella. I had space in my bag. What was I doing? And so that's a really small scale version of what Mark and Maggie end up doing. There is a 4-state storm that has been going on for 4 or 5 days, because when they finally get to the hotel where they're going to stay for the night, they find out that the people at the hotel haven't had potable water for a week. And yet here is this, this city folk couple who presumably has the television on all the time, the Weather Channel on all the time, but they've decided, because they're in Chicago, it's 90 degrees when they hit the road, how's it going to happen to them, right? Why would they run into the storm? And I love the idea of something like weather that is so beyond our control. And of course, in my book, the weather is just the weather, but it is also, it's the marriage. And you can love somebody as much as you want, but you cannot control what that other person's heart is capable of, or what it's going to do. We only have ourselves that we're in control of, and that's if we're lucky.
Yeah.
So some have characters who aren't even in control of themselves.
With both of your books, it almost felt to me like the weather was served like the haunted house does in those old movies from the 30s, 40s, 50s, where the characters who say, oh, there's no such thing as ghosts, there's no such thing as the supernatural, and they go into the house and they're always the first ones killed or scared to death. That as the weather intensified in both of the books, things got weirder and weirder. One of the scenes I love in your book, Hannah, is fairly early on, although the weather is looming, and Mark and Maggie stop at a gas station, and she is treated to one of those comments that women sometimes get treated to, where a man walks by in a cowboy hat and comments on her body. And then she doesn't know, he acts innocent, she doesn't know whether she heard it or not.
Right.
But things start to get stranger, almost like there's a climactic electricity in the air that's disturbing the atmosphere.
Things go downhill from there, in a slight way. And I reread that chapter not long after writing it, and I don't think it was until then, and the comment that this man made, and the doubt that Maggie feels. Did he say it? Did he not say it? I don't think it was until I reread that chapter that I realized that I was writing a thriller, because I was scared by it, and I was really uncomfortable with what a gentleman he seemed to be because she confronts him slightly, and he denies it, and he's sweet, and he waves to his wife in the distance, and his wife waves back, and I made myself really uncomfortable at that moment, and I thought, I think this book might be something other than what I meant it to be at the beginning, and I just sort of followed that trajectory, and that man, that character, was supposed to disappear, and then in the next chapter, which was Mark's point of view, I realized that he'd come back, and he's even creepier there, and more aggressive.
Yes. And then, of course, if Cass had been subjected to that comment, she would
have just kicked him.
She would have kicked him in the right place. I see in at least one interview, Elizabeth, you've talked about your affection for characters who are sort of unlikable, And I like Cass, but I'm not sure that she and I would do so well if we were seated next to each other on Amtrak. Or
Right.
you know, she's tough. She's brusque. She's not particularly nice. This issue of unlikable characters, especially in novels written by women, seems to keep coming up all the time. I guess Claire Massou in the Woman Next Door, was that the title?
Upstairs.
Upstairs, thank you. She was treated to a lot of criticism about this character who she had created who didn't seem particularly likable. Is there something defiant about creating a character like Cass who she isn't a nice girl? She goes, you know, V.I. Warshawski, Lisbeth Salander, all of those other not nice girl characters, I think 10 times better in terms of being an outlaw almost.
I was thinking of it consciously when I created her as a character, that I love Lolita. I love the fact that here is a character, a central character, a narrator who is, you know, a pedophile and a kidnapper. He's this horrible person, sociopath, and yet we are seduced by his voice enough that we read the entire book. And also by Patricia Highsmith's Ripley novels. And many of my works, earlier books and stories, have had unsympathetic female characters, because I've just found it an interesting perspective to write from. And technically, it was sort of a challenge that I set for myself with the Cass novels. How far could I go with this character and keep readers still come along for the ride? And it was interesting because with the first novel, which came out almost 10 years ago, the reviews of it, this was before The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo came out in this country. So there was, all of the reviews touched on the fact that here was this very unlikable, out there, traumatized person. But what some of the reviews talked about as being among her many transgressions, being bisexual and alcoholic and an addict and this, that, and the other, was that she was middle-aged. And that was considered to be a transgressive element. And one of my editors actually asked me with the second novel, would I make her younger? And I was like, well, how would that even work? And I said, no, I'm not going to do that. So I wanted to kind of set that bar and see where I could go with it. Yeah. I think she does have some redeeming qualities. I think if she was just a totally, she may be unlikable, but she has a certain kind of dark charisma, I hope. She certainly has a lot of fans that I think make people want to read about her. And I hear from a lot of women, a lot of young women, a lot of women, of a certain age, mine, who really relate to her. And some of them say, yeah, that's me, I've had those experiences. And some of them are like, oh yeah, I'm so glad I can be, my age, and I can live vicariously through a character who's a woman, who's, middle-aged, who's doing these things, and she doesn't give a.
Yeah.
I first encountered this comment about having characters, and specifically female characters, who were unlikable when I was still in school for creative writing. And I remember a young man who I liked quite a bit as a human being and a writer. We were workshopping a story of mine about a family of very strong women and the sort of weaker men that surrounded them. And he stopped mid-workshop and he said, you know what it is? And he had this southern accent. And he said, you know what it is? It's that I don't like him. I don't like a single woman in this story. And I remember turning bright red and, looking down. And of course, I looked down and I was torn between laughing and crying because there are 3 women and they were 100% me, my sister, and my mom. And I was like, well, you like me, don't you? All I'm doing is admitting what's going on behind the surface. Yeah. The layers and layers of complicated, complex thoughts that I think most of us, not just women, have. But the realization that, boy, it would be easier to lie right now, right? Just that on a daily basis. you know, I don't want to say something nice. I don't want to go to this party. I don't want to be nice and polite for a half a second. I'm tired. I love this idea of the middle age. Like, can you make her younger? That is just, that makes me want to make every character older.
Well, it'll happen sooner or later. You don't need to rush.
I don't know if either of you read Rebecca Traister's interview with Hillary a few months ago, in which she said that in her downtime, she loves to read Maisie Dobbs, and she loves to read Donna Leon's novel. And I did think, after reading that interview, as great as, I love both of those series for different reasons, but I kind of wanted her to pick up Cass.
Oh, good.
I thought, you know, a woman of a certain age, acting tough, you know, maybe she could learn a little from Cass about, you know, hanging tough. I don't know. I wanted to come back with you, Hannah, to talking about the domestic novel, because I can't figure out why, but I feel like we're living in this sort of golden age of these novels that are exploring marriage from both sides. And of course, there's Gone Girl. It just flew out of my head. I mean, there've been a whole slew of
Fates and Furies.
Fates and Furies, thank you, Lauren Groff, where you're getting a picture of a marriage from both sides. And I mean, I think one of the things you do so beautifully is you don't, Mark and Maggie are both, you know, they're equally compelling as voices and points of view. And I kind of found myself sympathizing with both of them and also then distrusting both of them. Why did you decide to write about a marriage at this point?
Up until last month, I was married. And I sometimes wonder if writing this book, I wasn't channeling, exercising some of the difficulties and tensions that I was aware of in my own marriage at the time, but didn't want to talk about or weren't coming to the surface in the right way. You know, I think, like a lot of writers, I definitely go to the pen and go to the paper when I should probably be using my words and talking out loud and you know, tapping into my emotions, but I prefer writing books. No, I wanted to, it's really important to me with every character I write, and specifically with this couple, to portray them believably, and I like every character I've ever written, and most of the characters that I've written have at least gotten 1 or 2 reviews that talk about their unlikability. And I think that they are all me to a certain extent. And in going back and forth between Mark and Maggie, it was very important to me to try to tell their stories from their points of view. And I think if there's a reason that I'm a good teacher or a good listener of other people, or if there's a reason that I'm a good friend, it's because before taking anything personally, I always try to imagine, wait a minute, I know, I'm going to keep using my sister as an example because she's in the audience. I know that my sister just said this terrible thing to me, but before I get mad at her, why don't I think about why she might have said it? And I try to trace through all of the reasons that she might have just said what she said to me. And I am always able to, rightly or wrongly, come up with a reason that makes sense to me and makes me forgive her before I can even be mad at her. And so when I'm talking about this husband and this wife, what I wanted to do was really try to tap into their points of view in an honest way. So Mark is mad at Maggie because she was mugged 9 months ago and she's not back to normal yet, right? And on the one hand, from Maggie's perspective and from Maggie's friend's perspective, and certainly from Cass's perspective, Mark is an asshole for not being more patient. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, from Mark's point of view, when you're reading his chapters, it's because he loves her so much and he misses what they had, and it's the impatience is because he doesn't truly understand the extent of her suffering, and part of that fault is because she's not using her words in the right way, to the right extent. So I think anybody who's married or anybody who's in a long-term relationship with a sibling, with a brother, a sibling is a brother, with a brother, a parent, a dog, you understand that there are ebbs and flows. And the reason that they last, if they last, is because at some point you start being able to try to at least put yourself in their shoes. And I wanted to take apart, I guess, my marriage and take apart just the idea, this is a crazy institution that many of us voluntarily enter into. It's insanity.
Yeah. No, I love the visual of them in the car down the road of life. That's kind of sometimes what it feels like, and there's no exit.
Chris Tillman told me famously, and I use this in class all the time, if you don't know what to write about, put two people in a car who don't like each other or who are fighting, something is going to happen. Right? They think they can stay quiet for 500 miles. They can't. They're going to have to talk at some point.
You've got two people in the car, but you've got three sentient beings. Dogs are now approved as, have been now acknowledged as sentient beings in France, at least. Yes.
That is terrific.
Isn't it great? I know. They're taking care of their dog, who I love the scenes where they keep running out into the rain, urging this dog to please do his business, and he's taking his sweet time.
Has anyone ever tried to walk a dog in the rain to make it use the bathroom? It's impossible.
And Cass, in a certain way, is taking care of a young girl at points in hard light. And again, it struck me that certainly this caretaking business, being responsible for somebody or a creature who isn't quite as capable, it added to the suspense of both stories. But were there other reasons why you threw these dependents into the story?
Well, I did it because, I wanted to have a means by which Cass could demonstrate some compassion, almost despite herself, which she's shown before. I mean, she, in Generation Loss, she helps find this, or looks for this runaway girl. There's nothing really analogous in the second book. But in this one, I wanted to kind of return to that because it seemed to me like it would be something that would come out of her character, that she is somebody, she was very damaged herself when she was a young woman, and when she sees, homeless kids on the street, when she meets the young girl Sam in West Penwith in Cornwall, this sort of very androgynous young person, she's kind of drawn to them. And with Sam, she kind of recognizes herself in a way. And so even though she's not, a Cass, a warm and fuzzy person, I think even people who are if we're going to be honest in looking at depicting unlikable people, and this is something when I am dealing with my, writing students, I tell them, the villains in a story do not perceive themselves as villains. The villains on the real world stage do not see themselves as the bad guys or the bad women. And I think it's important if you have an antagonist or if you have a flawed protagonist to kind of show all of that. If you have an antagonist, that person has some humane traits somewhere at some point in their life. Maybe they don't have it now, but as a child or something. So I think there's, it's like the Leonard Cohen line that there's a crack in everything. That's where the light gets in. And I think it's important to show that in people in characters who are flawed. We see it in characters who are not flawed. I have to say, just for the record, I did not find Mark and Maggie to be unlikable characters at all. I thought they were very real and honestly depicted. And I thought that your depiction of Maggie as somebody who has experienced a trauma and living with that, how that changes you and changes the way you look at the world, I thought that was really exceptionally well done. And to me, that, perhaps it didn't excuse her, some of her behavior, but it was the explanation that to me made perfect sense. And I could also see how Mark, not having had that experience and not being a woman and not being vulnerable in the way that she was and is, wouldn't get it and would kind of resent her would want his old wife back. So, but I didn't, I just wanted to say that.
No, thank you. We'd probably be friends. I think. No, and I'll promise I'll answer the question about the dog, but I was thinking about this recently, and the trauma that Maggie experiences, it's almost as though this is when she's eaten the apple, and she sees the ugliness of the world, and Mark hasn't eaten the apple yet, because prior to the mugging, they've both been living this sort of wonderful, complacent, in the best way possible, upper middle class, very pretty life. And lifestyle together. And Maggie takes a bite of the apple and she starts to see the world differently. And by the end of the book, it's, does Mark basically take a bite of the apple, and does he start to see the world as she does, but at least they're going to do it together, or, does he not? And I think the novel does answer that question, but Jerome, the dog, was always essential to me. They were never going to be in the car by themselves, and part of that is because I have a dog and I love dogs. And the other part of that is because a dog trainer told me about 2-3 years ago, he said, must have been longer than that, 4 or 5 years ago, he said, I'm distracted, we have 10 minutes left, just in case anyone's wondering. A dog trainer told me that he can walk into any house and he knows whether or not the people in the house with the dog have been fighting. And I looked at him and I was like, do you know that my husband and I have just been fighting? And he said, why do you think I said it? And I was like, go, fix our dog, dude. Fix the dog, and maybe that will fix the marriage. And he was telling me something that Cesar Millan says, that dogs are mirrors of their owners, and I think that is absolutely correct. So I thought, what a fun thing to give these people something to love, which is the thing I tell my writing students. I love your advice, the idea of the people who are bad don't think they're bad. I tell them, everybody loves something. Humbert doesn't just love Lolita, he loves language. He has a sense of humor. He is in awe of America, right? He can find beauty in anything. The kitsch is amazing to him. And so I'm always telling my students, don't make the stepmother 100% evil, because she can't be. That's not interesting. And so Mark and Maggie, even if you as a reader can't stand them, you're gonna love Jerome, and you're going to love that they love Jerome. So I think it's always important to have something that characters love, and for this childless couple, it was also essential that they had something that they both loved, and loved equally.
I could talk to the two of you for another 3 hours, but I know there are people in the audience who want to ask questions, and we are running out of time, so I'd invite anyone who wants to ask a question, comment, to please come to the microphone.
Hi, question for Ms. Hand. As a Fantasy Award winner, do you agree or disagree with the recent decision to remove H.P. Lovecraft's likeness from the award, and why?
Well, you guys think like Trump and Hillary are a big thing. I have to say myself, I've never been a Lovecraft fan, per se. So I think that, so I'm not a huge fan of his fiction, and I never have been. There have been a few stories that I like, but he's just not in my wheelhouse. And he was a racist and an anti-Semite, and, those things kind of bleed through into his fiction the way that somebody like Albert Payson Terhune, who was a writer I did love as a kid, and wrote around the same time, you can't reread his work now, or I can't reread it. So I was sorry, because the image for the World Fantasy Award, and that's affiliated with the World Fantasy Convention, for those who, most of you probably don't know it, it was a Gahan Wilson, who is the New Yorker cartoonist. Gahan did a caricature of H.P. Lovecraft, and it's a great image. So for that reason, I was sorry to see it go, but otherwise, I have to honestly say that, I can understand absolutely the reasons behind it. So,
I'm wondering, in your free time, if there is any, what sort of books do you yourselves read? Do you have any favorite author or authors?
I sure do, yeah. Doris Lessing has been taking up a lot of my time recently, and I think she is a terrifying writer, and I mean that in the right way. I read The Fifth Child, I think it's called, recently, and if anyone out there is on the fence about having children, read this book, and I think it's going to help you see clearly where you stand. So Doris Lessing is a go-to, and you're going to want to devour everything that she's written. Elizabeth Taylor is also somebody that I've discovered. I'm reading a novel right now called Angel by her, which is about a young writer with huge ambitions and a much higher opinion of her work than she should have. And it is funny, but it manages to be quite disturbing. Muriel Spark, these are all strong women writers. Tim O'Brien I go to all the time. In the Lake of the Woods is probably the book that I wish I could have written if I were capable of it and if it hadn't been written.
Because I do a lot of book reviewing and have for many years, and I teach at an MFA program, so I have to do so much reading of fiction for work that when I read for pleasure, which I don't have as much time to do as I really would like to, I tend to read nonfiction. So I tend to read historical, books about history. I like biographies. I'm not a huge fan of memoirs. Having said that, recently I read Hannah's book, which I loved. I'm reading Elena Ferrante's My Brilliant Friend, which I'm finding really interesting. And I'm reading a book about a village in 14th century France called Montaillou that I've been trying to get through for a couple of years. It's a great thing to read at night, like before going to sleep, because it's the perfect blend of like engrossing and completely tedious. So you could kind of, read a page or two, and I'm like, well, that's enough, which is like, it's taking me so many years to get through it.
My Brilliant Friend goes back to this idea where we started of the opening sentence. Yeah. The entire opening chapter, I don't know how she did it. You have to read the whole book to see, but I think, but you can't do this, but how? And I mean, it's a mystery and it's all there, but it's also nothing is there. It's just mind-blowing. It's an absolutely mind-blowing opening to a novel that then seems to be about nothing to do with it, but it has everything to do with it.
And then when you get to the end of the series, she comes back to that.
It's insane.
Yeah. Okay.
I have a question about story structure for both authors. I'm curious about how you find, or to what extent it is applicable or useful to use the ideas of the Joseph Campbell hero's journey type of story architecture as you're writing.
Yeah, I have found that useful. I tend to be kind of a seat-of-the-pants, organic writer. I don't really outline as much as I should. But when I'm forced to try to think through a schematic for a story, I do I'll do sometimes think of that, but I don't follow it very rigorously, I have to say.
I'm a fairly instinctive writer as well. I tell my students, every story is either a hero takes a journey or a stranger comes to town, and sometimes I find myself saying that, and I think, what does that even mean? I don't know. I mean, maybe. I hope it helps you. I don't outline much either until I get stuck. And for me, the way through a book is often writing the end. And so if I have enough at the beginning, if I've gotten halfway through and I know I don't want to abandon it, but I feel stuck, I think it's a lot like reading the last chapter or the last sentence. I think, where do I want them to be? And this was the case with Listen to Me. I had a realization. I didn't know what they needed to be doing in the car. I didn't know really yet what the book was about, but I had an image in my head of the ending. And so I wrote the end, and then it sort of fell together. It tumbled to the conclusion.
I think we have time for one more question.
I wanted to ask, did you always know that writing was what you wanted to do, or was it coming to that more of a process for each of you?
Oh, I've always wanted to be a writer. I didn't think it was possible. I thought that it was a fantasy, a 100% fantasy. No, and it is. I am grateful for it every day. I love it. It's the best job in the world. It's the hardest job in the world. I absolutely love it.
Yeah, what she said, exactly. Really, I've always wanted to be a writer, and I never, I'm still amazed. I'm amazed that I'm here, truly, every day, all the time, anytime if I'm in a bad mood or self-pitying or whining about something, I'll stop and think, could you ever have imagined that you would have done this, that you would have written books, because I was a relatively late bloomer by today's standards. I didn't really publish until I was about 30, early 30s. So there was a long time when I thought like, oh my God, this is just never ever gonna happen. I'm delusional. So yeah, I'm very grateful for it.
And so are we. Thank you. Thank you.
both.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.